Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm sharing some high impact techniques for card making using the new Yana's Tulips collection. This here is the Yana's Tulips die. Then we have the Tulips and Daffodils press plate, and this has a coordinating stencil to go with it to make it easy to color. I'm going to be using it with the stencil as well as without the stencil. Beautiful arrangement there. Then we have the Windmills and Tulips plate. I'm super excited about this one. I have Dutch heritage, so I loved seeing this one. This one also has a coordinating stencil set to go with it to make coloring easy. And once again, I'm going to use it with the stencil as well as without the stencil. Then we have the Bouquet of Hugs Sentiments press plate and die set. I always love Yana Sentiments because they have a combination of script as well as block text. So they have a lot of interest to the sentiments, and the sentiments are always beautiful. I'm going to start out with using the press plates in my Glimmer system. For these cards, I'm using some aura foil. This is a gold foil that has a holographic shine to it. So when you go and pair it with different colors for coloring it, it always coordinates beautifully with it. I love that holographic shine that it has. It just takes it to the next level in my opinion. So for the hot foiling, I have my Glimmer system nice and hot. I put the plate on there with the pattern side up. I put the foil on there with the pretty side down or the colored side down. And then I put my Hammermill Cardstock on there and plates on top of that. I press the timer button. Once that stops flashing, I run it through my die cutting machine. You need both the heat from the Glimmer system as well as the pressure from the die cutting machine to do that hot foiling. I do all of my foiling first, then I do solid hot foiling to use up those foil scraps. When you do the foiling, there's always the outside part, or the part that doesn't get foiled, left on the release sheet. So we might as well use that up. So sometimes I'll use it as is, not often, depending on what exactly it is. Sometimes I'll use it for a mat around my card, and I'm going to be using one of those solid hot foiled pieces for one of the mats around one of my cards. And then other times I just save it and use it for future projects, use it as specialty cardstock to die cut little pieces, especially like centers of flowers, things like that. It's a great way to use it up, to extend it, to add something a little bit different to your cards, because some of the foils are different from the specialty papers that you can find. So especially the Prism and the Aura foils that have the holographic finish. I don't think I've ever seen gold holographic cardstock. I could totally be wrong, but I can't think of any right off the top of my head. So I love doing that solid hot foiling and using that up. As well as if I'm not going to use it right away, it's much easier to store that negative foil on the cardstock. It's less likely to get damaged. So once I have my images foiled, I foiled the sentiments, and then I pull out my solid hot foil plate and do all of the solid hot foiling. And that process is exactly the same as regular foiling. The only difference is I don't have a press plate that has a pattern on it. I have the solid hot foil plate on the bottom, and the stacking is exactly the same. So with that, here is the solid hot foil, and that's why I don't use it for the front. It's really quite flashy. So most images, I think it's just too much for a card front. There's the odd time that I would use it, but most of the time I don't use it as is. Now, once I'm done my foiling, the first thing I typically do is clean up my foiling. Sometimes there's over foiling, and in this case, all those little teeny tiny squares in the windmill blades were still filled in. So I use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape. I usually use the 5/8 inch wide one. I put it on my shirt or pants a couple times just to remove a little bit of the sticky, and then I use that to lift up the foil. And it works really, really well to lift that up, and it's nice and effective. Typically, I'll do this first. There's also a sand eraser from Tombow that you can use if you have some stubborn areas that are not lifting up. And that's usually, in my opinion, with sentiments. I always find that there's some stubborn areas. I use that sand eraser for that, but the tape is a little bit more gentle. So I always start with the tape. I'm going to be cleaning up all three of the images. This windmill, especially the blades of the windmill, were the worst, but you can see that as I'm cleaning it up, the image just gets more detailed, finer. It just looks a lot better after it's cleaned up. And even the daffodil and tulip one to the left, it looks totally fine. You can't tell that there's overfoiling, but once I have used that tape on that background, you can see that it just really cleans it up and just makes it look a lot sharper and a lot more detailed. So for the windmill one, I did it over the entire surface because as I was doing it, I was finding more and more areas that looked like they had just a touch of overfoiling on them. When you look at the back of the tape, you can see where that foil gets stuck to that tape. And after it stops sticking to things, I will replace the tape with a new piece. This one here, I think I used 3 or 4 pieces of tape because I needed to, there was more foil than I realized, but the image looks so much better afterwards. And it only takes a few minutes to do this, but the result is definitely well worth it. Once I have done that to all 3 images, I go and I die cut my sentiments. I always love to have my sentiments ready to go to pop on the front of the card, and it's easy to die cut them all at the same time. The main thing to make sure, and I did this when I was positioning my plates to make sure that they were far enough apart that those dies wouldn't overlap. If as you're placing them, you'd have 2 dies that overlap, leave the second one off and do it as a separate run. We don't want anything overlapping, especially with the dies when die cutting, because that's how we ruin them. So first card that I'm going to be doing uses the stencil set with the Tulips and Daffodils plate. I am using it on my sticky mat. I do put a little bit of painter's tape on the top and the bottom of the stencil. Even though we have a little bit of a layer around the outside, it's not enough to hold it in place. So I use that tape to hold it in place and make sure it doesn't shift and move on me. First, I use some picked raspberry distress ink to do my ink blending, and then I go in with some Love Struck metallic ink. This just gives it a little bit of extra metallic shine. It takes it to the next level because you get a different finish from the regular distress ink, and I will be heavier towards the center of the flowers than the edge of the petal, which gives it more interest as well. Now for these cards, I'm using a combination of distress inks as well as the metallic ink pads from Lisa Horton Crafts, the colored ones. You could swap those out for interference inks if you want, or the color shift inks would be a little bit different just because of the way they blend. They wouldn't blend as well into the distress inks. But what I do when I'm doing that ink blending is I do my distress inks first, then I go in with the metallic inks so that I'm not contaminating my distress pads. A little bit of that distress ink, if it gets on your brush, is not going to contaminate your metallic pad. There's a minimal amount on there, but it does add a more interesting finish to the centers of the flowers because we have that touch of metallic in there. For that second layer, I used the same colors for the tulips at the top, but then for the other leaves for the daffodils, I used some Wilted violet distress ink as well as ultraviolet metallic inks. Now, I know that daffodils typically are orange and yellow, or yellow. Yellow happens to be my least favorite color, so daffodils are not one of my favorite flowers. However, I do know that you can get pink daffodils. So that's where my inspiration came. I looked for different color palettes or different colors for daffodils and found a bunch of different breeds, or hybrids of daffodils in different colors. So that was my inspiration for this. I typically lean towards pink, purple, blue flowers. Those are kind of my favorite color palettes to use, and I just love the way these look with those pinks and purples. I'm so happy with the final result of them. But if you love daffodils that are the yellow and orange, absolutely you can swap these out for yellows and orange. They're obviously yellows and oranges in the distress palette, as well as yellows and oranges in the Lisa Horton metallic ink pads. And again, you could swap those metallic inks for interference inks and you would get a beautiful look as well. The shine would just be a little bit different from the metallic. You'd have that interference shine, which if you're not familiar with interference inks, I have a whole playlist full of them in different ways that I like to use them. And I do pair them with distress inks regularly as well, so you can see how they look on there. For the greenery for these, I'm using some Twisted Citron distress ink as well as that Mojito metallic ink. I'm also going to pull in some Mowed Lawn distress ink because there wasn't enough color variation for me because of the 2 layers of leaves. So the first layer, I did that Twisted Citron with the Mojito metallic ink, and then I pulled in a little bit of Mowed Lawn just to get a bit of color depth, a little bit of darker greens in there. Those layering stencils make it so easy to color these images in. So now I'm ready to trim them down and assemble our card. So I trimmed this down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Then I have another piece of Hammermill cardstock here that I'm trimming down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I want to create a mat with that second piece there. So I'm using that ultraviolet metallic ink and just rubbing it around the edges of that cardstock, just the part of the cardstock that's going to be exposed. This gives you a mat that coordinates integrates perfectly with the stenciled image, and it also has that beautiful metallic shine to it. For my sentiment, I picked one of the foiled sentiments that I had die cut to the side, and I just use a little bit of the picked raspberry distress ink on it. I could have left that sentiment white, but it's going to be a lot more visible and a lot more high impact if I use the ink on it, and that foil resists that ink, so I don't have to worry about not being able to see the sentiment on top of it. So I'm gluing everything to an A2 card base and centering it. I'm using some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for assembling die cuts, or you'll see me use it for gluing down die cuts later on. But I also love it for assembling cards because it gives you that bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. And then once that glue starts to set, it's not going anywhere. So here's the final result. I love the contrast between that beautiful foiled image with those inks as well as the metallic inks. Metallic inks don't show up on camera as well as the foil and the regular inks do, but they really give the ink blending a lot more depth, and it gives it a different surface, a different finish to that. Next, I'm going to be using the Windmills and Tulips foiled image, and I'm going to color it this similar way with the layering stencils. Now, once again, I'm using my sticky mat. I'm using that painter's tape to hold those stencils down while I'm doing that ink blending. I'm doing my ink blending with large blending brushes for those distress inks. I have smaller ones to use with my metallic inks. For pieces like this, I will take some scrap paper if there's an area that's too close to an area that I want in two different colors and mask that off so that I don't accidentally get ink where I don't want them to. For most of the layers of stencils, I don't have to worry about it. Each of those layers are labeled with a number, so you know what order they're intended to go, but it doesn't really matter. You get the same result once you're finished. One of the ways that I often like to use stencils is I'll use my last layer with some Stickles glitter gel. I don't do it with these cards because I think that glitter, well, first of all, there wasn't an area that I thought would be perfect for glitter. I'll typically use them for like flower centers and things like that. And for this, I didn't really want all of my tulips to be glittered, so I just left it off. I use some metallic inks in some different areas just to give it that different finish to it. But mostly I'll use distress inks, and both the metallic inks and distress inks clean off the stencils really well. They just rinse right off. You don't need any special cleaner or anything, but those stencils really make it easy to color in those different areas. So for those tulips, I used the picked raspberry. For the greenery, I used that twisted citron. I'm going to add a little bit of that mowed lawn to the greenery just to give it a little bit more depth to it. This one here does the background behind those flowers, so I thought that suited it being a little bit darker. And this obviously is one of the areas where I used the scrap paper to mask off a different area. It sticks right to the sticky mat, so you don't need any adhesive to glue that down, but it keeps the area that you don't want, whatever color that you're ink blending with, keeps that nice and clean. For this here, I'm using some vintage photo distress ink for those browns on the windmill. You could also do them in grays, but I wanted to make sure that the blades of the windmill were nice and visible over that background. The stencils are nice and easy to line up, so it makes it really easy to color in the whole image. And this layering stencil, or these layering stencils, also have that background behind the windows, the sky area. So it's nice to be able to use these stencils for coloring in those as well. For the stems to the tulips, I used that Twisted Citron Distress Pad. Then we're ready to go into the sky. Now we have clouds here on this particular stencil, and I don't want to necessarily color the clouds. I want them to be mostly white, but I am going to use some hickory smoke towards the base of the clouds, giving them just a little bit of a shadow, just to give it a little bit more visual dimension. You could use something like Lost Shadow if you wanted, which is a lot lighter than the hickory smoke, but I already had it out for the blades of the windmill. So I'm just basically using whatever ink is left on my brush. I'm not adding much more ink to it so that I don't get that shadow too dark. And then I once again use that vintage photo for another area on the base of the windmills, but I do it in a lighter coat so that it has some contrast with the other parts of those windmills there. For the background for the sky, you could do it in just blue if you want, but because I already have the pinks out, I already have a purple brush, I'm just going to add a little bit of a sunset sky to it. So for the pink and the blue there, I didn't add any, or pink and the purple, I didn't add any more color to my brush. I just used what was on the brush because I want it to be nice and subtle. I want the focus of this image to be those windmills, to be the tulips. I don't want the sky to be the focus, so I don't want it to be too heavy. So just using whatever was left on on the brush was perfect. Then I used some tumbled glass for the top part of the sky. And by using the pinks and purples in there, that pink is going to coordinate nicely with the tulips in the foreground as well. For my sentiment, I want that to pop off of the tulip background. So I just use that tumbled glass on the sentiment. You could leave it white because we're putting this on a white card base. White would work as well, but I opted to ink blend it. So it just kind of tied in and coordinated well with the background. For this card, this is where I'm going to use one of my solid hot foiled pieces for the mat. So I'm going to use the piece that had the sentiments on it because it has a nice solid outline to it. I trimmed that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and I took my windmill and tulips piece and I'm trimming that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. You could trim this down before stenciling, but I typically like to color things first and then trim it down afterwards because sometimes there's an area that you tend to like more than others. And with that full image, it's easier to pick and choose which area that is. Now that we have everything trimmed down, we're ready to add it to the card base. So once again, using that Barely Art glue in the fine line bottle. When I glue this down, it's going to take a little bit longer for that glue to start to set on top of that solid hot foil piece because that foil is non-porous, so that glue doesn't absorb into the paper. It does set though. Now for the windows for the windmill, I wanted to add a little bit of color to them. There's not a stencil for it, so I just used a Tombow marker. This is N25, just to fill in those areas and give it a little bit more detail to it. And because those areas are tiny, I use the fine tip rather than the brush tip. There's a lot more control with that fine tip. So here is our finished card. I love the look of that foiled image with the pale distress inks in the background. I think it's just really effective. And by framing it with that foil as well, it ties into the foiled image and coordinates beautifully with that. For my next 2 cards, I'm going to watercolor those images. Now, most of the time I watercolor on white backgrounds, but it's fun to change that up and to watercolor on black cardstock. There's just different ways to do it though. Obviously, you can't use distress inks. They're transparent. You're never going to see them on the black background, but those metallic inks will work. They're water soluble, so you can watercolor with them. You could also use the coordinating layering stencil to stencil with those metallic inks on this black surface or on the black cardstock here. You wouldn't use watercolor cardstock. You just use plain black cardstock if you wanted to do it that way. However, by watercoloring them, you're diluting them a little bit. So you're going to get a lot more of a subtle look with watercolor than you are with just stenciling those inks right onto that cardstock. And I just think the look is a little bit more interesting and has a lot more impact to it because of the interesting look you get. So I have this black watercolor cardstock here. I used some embossing powder tool on it and then used some Versamark ink on my press plate. This is the Tulips and Daffodils press plate. And I'm heat embossing it with gold embossing powder. You can use whatever color you want. Obviously, black isn't going to show up very well. I chose the gold because it echoes the gold hot foil that I used for my foiled pieces. And I really like the look of that gold with the black, but I think silver would look fantastic as well. So once I have that embossing powder on there, I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder. And you can easily see how it goes from a dark granular look to a nice shiny gold outline there. You could watercolor it as is and then trim afterwards. I'm opting to trim down now. For this particular piece, I don't plan on having a mat behind it. I plan on just putting this on the card as is once it's watercolored. So I'm just going to trim that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. The other reason is I don't want to take too much of that image away. So for watercoloring with those metallic inks, these or re-inkers are available for these. They're out of stock right now with Scrapbook, but I just press that pad onto my surface. So that gives you that ink on your surface there. And then I use my water brush to bring it or to put it onto my brush and put it onto that cardstock. Now, when you first do this, it's going to be fairly transparent. It's going to show up a lot more as it dries. So I put it on there and I let it dry for a few moments and then I'll put another layer on there. Because we're watercoloring, we're adding water to this ink, so it is diluting it. So like I said before, it's not going to be as heavy and as dark as if you were to stencil with those metallic inks right onto this cardstock. And I encourage you to try both ways because both will look fabulous. This, I just think, has a subtle but absolutely beautiful look to it once it's done. Now, typically when I watercolor, I put my color where I want it darkest and then I blend it out. However, because we're working with black cardstock here, and obviously the black is darker than any color, I do the opposite for this. So I will start where I want my color to be lightest. So typically I will put my darker color towards the base of my leaves and then work my way lighter to the tip of the leaf. Here I'm putting the color on the tip of the leaf and then blending it out so that the base of the leaf is black. I'm not watercoloring the entire image. I'm just adding that hint of color on the outside of the different areas because I think it's just going to give it a lot more interest to it once it's completely done. My inspiration for this was those old velvet paintings that have color in some areas, but it fades to black. And I think it has a lot of impact to it. And I just really like the look of them for different things. Next, I'm going to use that Love Struck ink. This is the pink one, and I'm going to do the same technique. So I'm using this color around the outside of the centers of those flowers. I'm doing the same colors for these as I did with my stenciling. So my tulips are going to be pink. The inside parts of my daffodils are going to be pink, and the outer petals of those daffodils are going to be purple. So same with the inside part of the daffodils. I'm doing the tulip petals with the color around the outside fading to black. While we're doing that watercoloring, the color is a little bit more subtle while we're watercoloring than when it's dry because that water there is making everything dark. As it dries, you're going to see it just a little bit more. It's still going to be subtle. It's not an in-your-face watercolor, but I think it's absolutely beautiful when it's done. So the water brush that I'm using has water in the handle. What you can't see here is I have a piece of paper towel to my right. So anytime I want to take whatever is on my brush off, I will wipe it on that paper towel. If I happen to have too much water on my brush, I can wipe it on that paper towel and it'll suck the water out of my brush. If I need to change colors, I just squeeze that handle and it cleans out the bristles of my brush. So I love using this watercolor brush. I tend to be a klutz, so if I were the type to have a bottle of water on my desk, there's a very good chance I would either drink it or spill it. So by doing this, I don't have to worry about spilling anything. I find it the cleanest, easiest way to do watercolor. If I have gone through all of that metallic ink on my palette using water with it, I don't want to go and do that again because it's just going to dilute it more. So I will wipe that off, press that pad onto my surface again to create another palette of color, and then I will go color with that and add different layers. So you can add as many layers as you want. The one thing that I would do though is as you're adding those layers, make sure you wet down that entire area that you're watercoloring. Now, one of the reasons why I embossed this piece before watercoloring is that raised embossed surface or the raised embossed line makes it much easier for watercoloring. It makes it so that that watercolor stays in the area that you want. It also gives you a different texture from the background. I always prefer embossing when I do watercolor because sometimes when you're watercoloring, it can end up being a little flat. If we have matte ink with matte watercolor, I just find that it looks flat, and I always love different textures and different surfaces when I am creating. So by doing that embossing, it gives you that metallic edge to it and gives you that raised surface. If you wanted it to be more subtle, you could use black embossing powder here, but I think that gold has a lot more impact to it than black would. I think it would be a little bit flat and a little bit, you'd have to kind of be staring at it to figure out what the image was if we did this with black embossing powder. Other images might work, but I think for this one, using that gold or even using a silver, if you prefer silver, is much more impactful than it would be to use a black or even a white. I think white would be beautiful, but I don't think it would be as beautiful as the metallic embossing is here. So with that purple, once again, just like the pink, once I've gone through that whole square of ink on my surface and hydrated it with water, I will wipe that off and I will press that pad on there again to get more ink there. Now, if you happen to have the ink reinkers for these pads, you could use that as an ink palette instead of using your ink pads. And I will often use reinkers, especially distress reinkers for watercoloring, but I wanted to share that you can use the pads as well. As long as they're water soluble, you can use them as well. Now, instead of having a mat around this piece, I just used my Love Struck pad and just wiped it around the outside edges. We're going to get just a little bit of that gold around the edges when you tilt it into the light. I didn't want to do a mat and have the gold pad on that mat because this is a very subtle look to it. And if we were to put that mat behind there and have, I said gold, but I meant the Love Struck, the pink one, or the purple, whichever one you want. If we were to do that as a mat around it, it would be much more bright than the watercolored image, and I think it would take attention away from that. I like this because it is a subtle look to it, and I think having a mat around that would take away from that. So that's why I opted not to do that, but I do like having a different color around the edge. So I just use that ink pad right around the outside edges. Again, it's just as subtle as the watercolor, but it does catch the light as you're tilting it into the light. And you can definitely see the color on here, but it's not in your face color. And I think that's what makes it so beautiful. For my next one, I'm going to be using the Windmills and Tulips, and this one I'm going to do the watercoloring on white background, so you can see the difference between the two. So this here is Distress Watercolor Cardstock. It's one of my favorites for watercoloring with light background, simply because it's nice and bright white, so you see true color to it. So I'm taping it to the clear plate on my Better Press system, using that embossing powder tool on there, and then using that Versamark ink on that background plate. And then I'll put that clear plate to the base and run it through my die cutting machine to press that image onto that watercolor cardstock. And just like the last one, I'm going to emboss this with gold. You could, if you want, for this one, change it to black if you wanted it to be a bolder image. But I think with that gold powder, it just makes the image itself shine. It really makes the colors a lot more vibrant. It doesn't, for this one, I just think it's prettier with the gold metallic ink, but I definitely think it could look nice with black as well. It would just have a bit of a different feel to it. Now, anytime I'm heat embossing with Better Press plates, when possible, I will use extra fine or super fine embossing powder. It just gives you a lot more detail to it. Now, before embossing, you want to clean up. If there's any embossing powder where you don't want it to go, you want to rub it off. I did that with my finger there. It didn't ruin any of the image, but I couldn't find the little small brush that I normally use. But you definitely want to clean that off before you do your heat embossing. Once it's melted onto that background, you're not going to get it off. So if you happen to have any powder where you don't want it to go, soft brush helps to remove that, and then you can clean it up before you use your embossing tool on there. So once I have this embossed, I'm going to watercolor this as well. And once again, I'm going to be using the same colors of ink that I used for stenciling. For this one here, even though I will typically do my watercolor with distress ink with re-inkers, I opted to just use the pads. I already had the pads out, so I'm just going to be using that for the watercoloring. Now, when you watercolor with distress pads or with any water-soluble pad, it is going to be a lot lighter than if you use a re-inker. A re-inker, you will have just a puddle of that ink, so you'll be able to get a lot darker and then watercolor it out to really light. So both works, using the pad or using the re-inker. You have a few more, a little bit more options when it comes to the re-inker, because you can get a lot more darkness to it, but not everyone has re-inkers for their pads. So you can easily do this if you have water-soluble pads, and they have to be water-soluble. You cannot do watercolor with a pad with an ink that is not soluble with water. You can easily just press your pad onto a non-porous surface. Here I have a Tim Holtz Media Mat that I have on my surface right now. So I'm using that. If you don't have a Tim Holtz Media Mat, you could just use, say, a sour cream container, an acrylic block, anything non-porous that your ink will sit on the top. You can use that as a palette. So I start with watercoloring the sky. When I'm watercoloring, I'll typically watercolor my background first and kind of work my way to the foreground. The only time I go out of that rule is if I'm waiting for an area to dry. So I'll watercolor something that's far away from that area so that I don't accidentally contaminate it or have a different color run into there. So just like my stenciling, I'm going to use a little bit of that hickory smoke to add a bit of dimension to the clouds. So I just do it on the bottom of the clouds to give them a little bit of a shadow to them. Now, I did not do a sunset background for this one. I opted to just do it as a blue sky, but you can easily create a sunset background if you wanted to. I opted to do all of my windmills with that hickory smoke instead of using the vintage photo like I used when I did my stenciling. And I'll use my color when I first put the color on my brush, I will put that color where I want the piece to be darkest. So I will put that color where I want it to be darkest, and then I will blend it out so that it's lighter. Now, Same goes when you're using re-inkers. I will put the color, because I have the most color on my brush when I first re-inked it, I will start where I want that color to be darkest, and then I will blend it out to be lighter. Now you can always add more color, and if you have to take any color away, I clean my brush off on that paper towel that I have, and I will lift that color up. When you're watercoloring, it sits on the surface for just a few moments, so you do have time to lift that color up and remove it. Once I have the windmill bases done, I'm going to, or I did the kind of walking path or the ground in front of it with that same hickory smoke. And then I pulled out the mowed lawn to do the little bushes right between all of those windmills. And I'm going to use that same color to do the background behind the tulips. And just like my sky, doing my sky before I do the windmills, I will do the background behind the tulips before I go and color the tulips. So I'm using that mowed lawn. And obviously it's not nearly as dark as when I do my ink blending with it. You can have a lot more, a deeper color when you have it not diluted with water. When you dilute it with water, obviously it's going to get a little bit lighter. But I start that green in the distance where I want it to be darker in the background, and then I work my way to the front where I want it to be just a little bit on the lighter side. Now these tulips also have tulip leaves on them. So once I've done the greens on my background, I'm going to use that same mowed lawn to fill in some of those leaf areas. I'm not going to fill in every single one of them. I don't think it's necessary. For me, the focal point of this image is the windmills and the tulips. I don't think I need to have the greenery and the leaves for all of those tulips completely colored in and contrasting the background behind it. But I do think it adds some color variation by filling in some of those with a little bit darker shade of the mowed lawn than what's already there. And I think it fills in that area just a little bit better. So I do that while everything is still wet, and then I'm going to let that dry just a moment and do my tulips. Now, because that image is embossed with that gold embossing powder, I don't need to wait too long. I don't need to worry about my green running into my pink for my tulips. I only wait for it to dry long enough so that if I happen to touch it, I'm not getting a fingerprint in wet paint. For the lights, for the windows for the lighthouse, I'm using the Sunshine Metallic ink. This is in the same line as the pink, green, and purple that I've used for the other pieces. I just wanted it to be a little bit brighter color, and I hadn't used a yellow for any other areas for this before. So I pulled out that Sunshine. So it not only adds that bright yellow, it has that touch of metallic. Those areas are really, really tiny though, so you don't actually see much of the metallic, but it's a nice bright yellow. For my tulips, I'm going to do some of the tulips in the pink and some of them in the purple. So I start with the Love Struck, pressing that pad onto my surface, using that brush in that ink, and I start at the base of the tulip and then work my way up. So this goes to where I was talking about, I start where I want my color to be darkest and work my way up. You can see that because I start at the base of the tulip and then work my way up each of those tulips, the base of it is darker and the tips of the petals have a lot lighter color to them. So again, gives it some color variation, a little bit more visual interest by having some areas lighter and then some darker. Then I grab the ultraviolet and do the tulips towards the bottom of the image. Same way as those pink tulips, I start where I want the color to be darkest and then blend my way out. And you can see that I flipped my image upside down to do this. It makes it much easier to have that image upside down and have your brush pointing the way that you want the color to be darkest and then blending your way out, than flipping or then having the image right side up and having to twist your hand to create that motion. So I will regularly be rotating my piece to work well with the ways that I want my image colored. And it's much easier to have the image upside down so that you get it the way that you want it to go. I missed a couple pink tulips there, so I grabbed a little bit of that Love Struck and added it to that. And here we have those beautiful tulips finished. When I first had envisioned this, I hadn't really looked at the plate too hard. I love looking at images with rows of tulips in all different colors, and I thought it would be fun to do that. And then I looked at the image and realized that they're all scattered, so it didn't really make any sense. We didn't have any clean rows here. So for this image, I thought it was fun to do a couple different colors of the tulips, but also be fun to completely change it up and have all sorts of different colors for those tulips. I added a little bit of hickory smoke for the details for the windmill blades. And then I let that dry for a few moments. For this card, I thought it would be nice to create a shaped card. So I brought out my Essential Arches die set. I used the largest one with lilac cardstock for my card base. The next size down, I used it with some matte treasured gold or gold treasured cardstock for a mat around my image. And then the size right below that, I used that to cut my image out so that we have a nice mat around it, but it has the purple base to it that echoes with the colors of the tulips. And that arch shape, I thought it worked well with the way that the tulips were, or that windmills were on that background. It just kind of echoed the size of them and the finish of them. So that's why I chose the arches for that. I thought it just looked great with that image. So for my card base, I did my score mark at about 4.5 inches. Then I folded that to make sure I had a nice hinge, glued that to the other piece of lilac cardstock that was cut with the Arches die set, added the mat to it, and then added my image piece to the front. For my sentiment, I'm using one of the foiled sentiments and just adding a little bit of ink blending on there because we don't have a white card base here. I thought it would look odd to have a white sentiment on there, so I just added that pink to it. I chose the pink because the pink tulips were in the background and the purple tulips were in the foreground. So it was going to just echo the colors just a little bit better and be a little bit more of a contrast to those purple tulips. Now to add just a touch more texture to this card, I'm using some glossy accents on the centers of the windmill blades as well as the windows. Now, because those areas are so tiny, it was hard to get within the lines. So I use a corner of a cardstock scrap in order to clean that up, and it cleans it up really, really well and doesn't damage the cardstock, and then let that completely dry. But it adds that beautiful shine and that domed dimension to those windows there. And that won't take very long to dry because those dots were really quite tiny. Now for my last two cards, I'm going to be doing some paper piecing with the Yana's Tulip die set. Now when I created the sentiments with the Glimmer system at the beginning, that set has 5 sentiments in it. I'm creating 6 cards, so I need one more sentiment for one of my cards. So I'm going to put the sentiment right on the background of the card. I have some indigo cardstock here using a little bit of embossing powder tool on there. And then I am picking my sentiment, putting that on my press plate or my better press system and inking it with that Versamark ink. I'm going to heat emboss that with gold on my background here. So I put the clear plate onto the base once it's inked, put it through my Platinum 6 machine, and now we've got that sentiment pressed into the bottom right corner of the front of my card, and I can add the embossing powder to it. So when you're putting your sentiment on your better press system, you want to put it the opposite side of your card that you want it to go on because it's kind of a reverse image there. So once we have this sentiment on here, we're ready to start creating the rest of our card. I have pieces die cut for the front of my card. I am taking a piece of matte gold cardstock from the Treasured Cardstock pack. I'm trimming that down to 4 inches by 5.25 inches. The piece that I just added that sentiment to, I'm trimming that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Now, typically I would take this piece and die cut my tulip out of it. Because we're going to put another piece on top of that, it just extends that cardstock a little bit more. I just die cut, or I had my piece die cut out of another piece of matte gold cardstock that was a scrap from a previous project. So I didn't have I already had it die cut when I cut this mat out, but it's a great way to extend your cardstock by die cutting behind an area that is going to be covered, especially your specialty cardstocks. They tend to be a little bit more pricey, so why not extend the how much you can use them. So once I have that matte gold outline of the tulip on the front of the card, I'm inserting the different pieces to that tulip. Now this is just like creating a puzzle or inserting pieces to a puzzle. They fit right in there because the die cut for cutting out those pieces is exactly the same as the one for die cutting the outline to it, but it has a beautiful look to it. So we have the gold for the matte outline outside of our indigo piece. We have the gold outline for the tulip, and then we have the gold sentiment embossed on the bottom right. So it just creates a beautiful final image to it. And this can be done with any die set that has an outline to it. I know a lot of Yana's pieces have different outlines to them. So this is a great way to use these and to create some interesting looks for the fronts of your card. Now, the flower itself, I die cut those pieces out of Dahlia cardstock as well as Wildberry cardstock, and then I inserted the different pieces where I wanted them to go. Now I didn't want the inner pieces for that tulip going to waste, so I die cut a second outer line or outline edge out of some black mirror cardstock from the Onyx Treasured Cardstock pack, and I'm going to inlay these into the front of the card. So I have a piece of Hammermill cardstock here. I'm using the outline die from that Tulip die set to die cut that piece out of that area there. And then I'm going to glue these pieces together. So I'm going to glue my mirror cardstock here, and you can see where I die cut the outline die in that piece. This piece here is going to cover it over top, so you're never going to know that there was an area that was die cut out of the background because it's going to be completely covered. Now I glued my Hammermill piece with that tulip outline in there, and then I can insert all of those pieces in there like a puzzle piece. Now for this one here, I'm using the black mirror for the outline. So this is the same cardstock that I used for the mat around the outside of the front of the card. And then I'm going to use the gold mat on the inside of it. But I encourage you to definitely play around with your pieces. This would be great using glitter cardstock for the inlay or other types of specialty cardstocks mixed with regular cardstock. And especially when it comes to those tulip petals, those pieces are quite tiny, so you could easily use scrap pieces for that as well. I chose to keep this card white, black, and gold, something that's very, very simple. But like I said before, we're using Barely Art glue on specialty cardstock. This has a plastic coating to it, so it's going to take just a little bit longer for that glue to dry. And you can see when I lifted my acrylic block, it stuck to the acrylic block more than it stuck to the mirror cardstock below it. So you do have to be patient with it and let that have a few more minutes to dry than if it was just regular cardstock. But we have a lot of impact here with the different finishes. We have just the matte finish of that Hammermill cardstock. We have the glossy finish of the black cardstock there. And then we have the matte finish of the metallic gold cardstock. So it's very, very simple, very easy to do, but it has a beautiful look to it because of those different specialty cardstocks there. And with that last card, because of the combination of the specialty and regular cardstocks with that dark background. So here is our finished tulip card. I opted to keep the sentiment on there. It's just a foiled sentiment that I did at the beginning of the video. I left it as is. If you wanted, you could do a little bit of ink blending around the outside edges with black ink, but I wanted the impact or the focal point to this card to be that tulip. You can read that sentiment really, really well in person. It just looks a lot more subtle on camera. Then we have our second to last card there with the tulip on the indigo background, with that beautiful gold outline to it and our gold heat embossed sentiment. The Windmill card with that shaped arches card base. I think this one would also be a great one to combine that arch Pearson punch plate that came out. I think it was January that it came out. It's a gorgeous one, but I think that one would create a fun frame around those windmills as well. Then I think this one might be my favorite, the watercoloring with metallic inks on the black cardstock. I just love how you see that color, but it's subtle. I think this one would make a great sympathy card because it's just beautiful, it's elegant, it's subtle, and it's not in your face with color. Then we have our windmills and tulips that are that were colored using the layering stencils, and then the very first one with the tulips and daffodils using the layering stencils as well as the metallic inks. And those metallic inks just give some beautiful shine to these images and just take them to the next level as well. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate you being here. You'll find everything I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. I hope you have a fantastic day.